Chief Secretary, thanks for joining us. Let's start with something from the past. Can you remember when you wrote these words? It says here, a Republican candidate as repugnant as Donald Trump spells a much longer-term problem for the centre-left of politics than it does just for the outcome of this presidential term. Can you remember that? 2016,
the year before I was elected as a Member of Parliament. And look, we can all go through line by line what people have said in the past.
Indeed, it's well remembered. You were sitting in a bar after a week's hard campaigning for Hillary Clinton. And the thing that strikes me is that you were very prescient, actually. Donald Trump is going to be a problem for quite a long time. Why hasn't the centre-left found an answer?
Hey, that's a big question. I mean, you're right that President-elect Trump won decisively in the United States. The Electoral College, the popular votes, the Senate, the House of Representatives. And, you know, it's for the Democratic Party, Labour Party's sister party, to make sure they really understand why voters are voting for the other team and not for ours. I mean, I think it's a deep question. My observation from a UK perspective is that, you know, people want a government that can deliver tangible benefits for them in their communities. And it's no good just pointing to OBR graphs, maybe, and saying, you know, these forecasts look great. We've got to make sure as a government here in the UK that people feel the benefit of the change that we promised, and that's what we're working to deliver.
Well, you're right to mention the forecasts, which for you, frankly, don't look that terrific. You've had to downgrade your expectations of growth, for example, which is your central mission.
Well, the downgrade, without getting too into the weeds, was a comparison with the OBR forecast under the last Conservative government.
Back in March.
Which the OBR has said, had they had all the information transparently from the Conservative Party at the time, their forecast would have been materially different. So you can't compare March to the latest forecast, but there is growth forecasted in the OBR projections over the next 5 years. We welcome that. It's more growth than we've had in the past 5 years, but do we want more? Absolutely we do. That's why Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, in her Mansion House speech this week will be talking about how we're going to be going after growth in the years ahead.
All right, well, let's see if we can match up growth with your responsibility, which is spending, that is to say, making sure that the extra money that you've raised in taxes ends up in the right place at the right time. Today we're thinking a lot about defence spending, of course, and you said that you want to get it to 2.5%. Chief of Defence Staff says that's going to happen, but doesn't know when. Can you help us out? When are you going to hit that number? And where's the extra, what, 6-7 billion going to come from?
Yeah, so we made a commitment in our manifesto at the election to reach 2.5% of GDP on defence spending. We're currently at around 2.3%. But the when question will be answered when the Strategic Defence Review has concluded. This is the big review the Defence Secretary is doing at the moment to understand what we need to buy and what our priorities are in the world. And then that has to align to the spending decision. So I'll be able to answer that question probably in the spring of 2025 once those reviews have concluded.
Well, one of your colleagues has already more or less given an answer, and I want to remind you of this. The Chief of Defence Staff told us that he wants our armed forces to be stronger. 5 days after your general election victory, the Armed Forces Minister, Luke Pollard, said that you would not increase military spending without growing the economy. Now, does that mean that the anemic rates of growth, which are being projected by the OBR, are putting our national security at risk? Or to put it the other way, we don't get more national security until your hopes of growth are realised?
So a bit of both. So Luke is right to point out that the way to generate more money for public services, whether it's defence spending or other areas of spending, is to get the economy performing well. That's why we talk about growth all of the time. And there are great, you called them anemic. I welcome the growth figures. As I say, we should...
1.5%, pathetic.
Well, on average over the forecast period, it's higher than that. But as we've already agreed, we'd like more, and that's what we're working to deliver. But that doesn't mean that you don't spend what you need to spend on defence right now. We've already increased the defence budget by about £3 billion in the budget last week. Ministry of Defence spends between kind of 50 and 60 billion pounds a year, and there are big questions about how we spend that to match the priorities that we face as a country. That's what the Strategic Defence Review is working on.
But what's the principle here? Foreign Secretary says he agrees with Mr. Trump that we're not spending enough. Does the government want to spend more money irrespective of growth, or is it entirely dependent on getting that growth figure up?
So it's government policy that we want to get to 2.5%. And then the question is how? And as we've just talked about, there's a trade-off there between new money coming in the door and that going on.
So we've got to wait until we see whether your growth plans work, before we can spend on more defence.
Well, as I say, the Strategic Defence Review will align with the spending review that I now have to run, reporting in the spring. And we'll make the decisions about the current budget and how that's spent. We'll confirm the date of the trajectory to 2.5 next year. But you're right, if there's new money coming in the door because the economy is performing well, then that will go against our manifesto commitments, one of which is 2.5%.
I mean, this is a very interesting point, and you're very clear about it. For you, it's a trade-off. In the Kremlin and Beijing, they don't have that sort of... They don't make that kind of equation. They simply say, we have to spend whatever we need to defend our country. We are essentially putting national security at the mercy of the economic winds.
No, national security is a foundation for this government, as it should be for...
So why not say that come what may, we're going to hit the 2.5%, we'll find the money from somewhere else?
Well, that may be one of the decisions in the future, but today we're spending 2.3%. The question is how you spend that. But defending the country is a non-negotiable. That is not a trade-off. The trade-off is then with other areas of public spending. Okay. Now, are we defending the country today? Absolutely we are. Do we want to make sure we're hitting our NATO obligations? Absolutely we do. But the Strategic Defence Review will start to answer some of the questions, which is beyond that. What more does the UK want to offer as part of our global alliances? And that's where you start to think about...
OK, well, let's talk about the other areas of spending, or indeed, let's stay for a moment with defence. We don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine, but if the Americans stop or reduce funding to Mr. Zelensky, as Mr. Trump has implied, are we going to step up to the plate? Will we replace the billions that the Americans are spending?
Well, it's a hypothetical question, so you'll forgive me for not answering.
Well, Mr. Trump hasn't been that hypothetical. He's pretty clear.
Sure, but we're going to continue to work with the Biden administration until the inauguration on current American policy bases. That aligns with our position in the UK, where we want to support Ukraine, that our support for Ukraine is resolute. We don't want any countenance of the idea that we're stepping back from that. That's why we're offering them £3 billion a year, which, you know, in the fiscal context here in the UK is difficult, but the right decision for us. But you'll forgive me for not answering hypothetical questions about future foreign policy scenarios.
Yeah, but it's part of your job to look forward into the future and get us prepared for that. Are you prepared? Do you have the insight? Have you done the modelling to work out what we might do if the Americans retreat?
So officials will be considering and planning lots of different scenarios, as they would do under any administration, to make sure that the UK is in the strongest possible position.
And the Americans winding down their support is one of those possible scenarios?
Well, at the moment, that is not American policy. And of course, when President-elect Trump comes into office, we'll be engaging with them to understand if and how their policy will be changing. All
right. Well, let me ask you about something about which the President-elect has been even clearer. He wants to impose tariffs, particularly on Chinese goods, but he's been pretty straightforward. He wants to impose tariffs on imports to America from all over the world, which presumably includes us. Have you got the Treasury working on what that would mean for us?
Well, you were right to allude in your question that there was a presumption in the assertions you were making. Much like with defence spending, of course, officials will be considering lots of different scenarios. But the position of the government is that we support free trade and we support the trading relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. It's a very strong, very fruitful relationship, both for us, but also for the American economy. And of course, we want to protect that and strengthen it in the years ahead. And I think President-elect Trump has said that. I mean, he recognises the important relationship the US has with the with the UK, and that's the basis on which we will be cooperating in future years.
Yeah, but Mr. Trump is a businessman, as everybody keeps telling us, and sentiment is not part of the Trump lexicon. If he decides that that's what he wants to do, you're not going to tell me you're going to wait until he decides to say, this is what we're going to do, to say what we might do. What are you planning in the event that Mr. Trump says, OK, we won't treat you like China, but we're going to treat you like the rest of the world, and there will be tariffs on imported British goods. What's your plan?
You'll have to forgive me, Trevor. I'm not a commentator, I'm a cabinet minister. As I've said, it's appropriate for officials to plan for different scenarios, but you are asking me to comment on sensitive, hypothetical future scenarios. It would not be appropriate for me to give you my personal view about that. But what it is appropriate for me to say is that, of course, our relationship is important. The UK government will work with the new American administration, and we will try to understand what decisions President-elect Trump's administration will take.
You say it's not appropriate, but just very quickly, the markets watch these interviews.
Yeah, exactly.
And a cabinet minister who says, well, we really don't quite know what we'd do if we were hit with tariffs, is not inspiring confidence. It's not what you said. So you do have a view. You're just not telling me.
What I'm telling you is that the government prepares for all scenarios and will work with our American counterparts in the normal way. But it's important not to put words in my mouth, especially when the markets are watching.
All right. Well, let's see if we can arrive at something which might make people feel a bit more confident. Given that you need some help here, possibly, given that all the things that Labour people have said about Mr. Trump, would it be wise to take advantage of Nigel Farage's offer to be an intermediary for our government with the Trump White House?
Look, it's not for me to advise Mr. Farage about his career options.
No, I'm not asking you to advise him. I'm asking you whether you take advantage of his offer.
I think that's
free.
I think that's probably unlikely. My advice to Mr. Farage would be he might want to concentrate his efforts on the constituents in Clacton that elected him into office, as opposed to spending his time in the United States of America.
Well, you know, OK, I'm laughing about it, but there is a serious point here. Your leader has said time and time again, I remember it from his conference speech, we will always put country before party. Man comes along, it might be a different party, and he says, I can help you. And it's manifest he can help you. He is close to Trump. Trump listens to him because Trump tells the world that he listens to Nigel Farage. Why would you snub the offer of help? That's a help for the country, unless you're putting now your party's interests and dislike of Mr. Farage before the country's interests.
Well, I'm sure Mr. Farage will be pleased you're making the case for him. I mean, look, the counterfactual here is that we do not have influence and we do not have relationships. That's just not true. Karen Pierce, our ambassador in the United States, the team, the foreign secretary, people that work in government here in Westminster have got relationships with President-elect Trump, Vice President-elect
Yeah, but none of them gets invited to Mar-a-Lago. None of them gets photographed in Trump Tower. Why don't you use this man who's offering you help?
As I say, I think he should focus on working with his constituents in Clacton, who deserve a bit of a full-time MP as opposed to a transatlantic commentator.
OK, well, let's talk about what you're doing here. We are still in the first moments of sorting out the legislative fallout from the budget. You've got to have finance bill and all of that. You hit employers and country with a 40 billion tax rate when you promised you wouldn't. This week you increased tuition fees when your leader once promised to abolish them. The OBR and Bank in England say that the budget's going to keep inflation higher than it would otherwise have been. Do you understand why it's hard for people to believe in the promise of sunny uplands?
Well, I think it's important to deal with the fact. I mean, inflation is close to target at 2%, and the long-term forecast for inflation is strong. And by the way, very, very different to the 11% that we hit under the Conservatives when they were last in government and lost control.
No, but this is all the stuff that you've done.
Sure, but I'm just answering the points you've made. So inflation was one. The second was on tuition fees. I think you were alluding to something that the Prime Minister said many years ago before the Conservatives crashed the economy. If you're going to scrap tuition fees, you have to pay for it. That isn't a priority right now, given that we're short of money. And shall I just deal with the first one that you raised, which I think was about the tax bill? We made a commitment in the election not to increase taxes on working people. That meant income tax and employer national insurance, as well as VAT and corporation tax for business. We've honoured that promise, but we needed to raise taxes in order to deal with the black hole that we inherited from the Conservatives. So I do think those are promises that have clearly been honoured, and I think voters can see that.
We will no doubt be talking about those promises again and again. Chief Secretary, thank you for your time this morning.
My pleasure.